The year was 1900, a time of great change and anticipation. Russia stood at the precipice of a new century, a nation teetering between tradition and modernity. Ruling over this vast and diverse empire was Tsar Nicholas II, a man of deep convictions and unwavering faith. He was the Tsar, the all-powerful emperor, believed to be chosen by God to lead his people. By his side stood his beloved wife Alexandra, a woman of strong will and deep devotion. Together, they were the epitome of wealth and privilege, living lives of unimaginable luxury. Nicholas was a Romanov, from a dynasty that had ruled Russia for over 300 years, a lineage steeped in history and tradition. Their life was a whirlwind of glittering balls and lavish ceremonies, a constant display of their immense power and influence. They lived in opulent palaces, surrounded by the finest art and treasures from around the world. Servants catered to their every whim, ensuring that their lives were as comfortable as possible. The future seemed secure. It promised to continue their legacy of power and grandeur, a legacy that seemed unshakable. Nicholas was a devoted family man, deeply committed to his role as a father and husband. He adored his wife and children, finding solace and joy in their company amidst the pressures of ruling. He had 4 beautiful daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, each one cherished and loved. Then, finally, came the longed-for heir, Alexei, whose birth was celebrated throughout the empire. Young Alexei was afflicted with hemophilia, a condition that cast a shadow over the family's happiness. This is a genetic blood disorder that caused great concern and required constant medical attention. Alexandra, desperate to save her son, turned to mysticism and spiritual healers in her quest for a cure. She placed her faith in the hands of Grigory Rasputin, a self-proclaimed holy man whose influence would grow alarmingly. This decision would prove disastrous, as Rasputin's presence and actions stirred controversy and distrust. Nicholas was a deeply religious man, believing firmly in his divine right to rule. He believed in his divine right to rule, a conviction that shaped his approach to governance. However, he was ill-prepared for the challenges of governing a vast and complex empire, facing mounting pressures from all sides. Russia was a land of immense contrasts, with vast differences between the lives of the rich and the poor. The privileged few lived in luxury, enjoying the finest things life had to offer. The vast majority of the population were impoverished peasants struggling to survive in harsh conditions. Change was brewing. The Romanov dynasty remained oblivious to the storm on the horizon, unaware of the impending revolution that would change everything. Beneath the surface of Imperial Russia, a storm brewed. Social and economic disparities were stark. The vast majority of Russians were peasants. They toiled on land owned by a wealthy elite. Industrialization was changing the landscape. It created a new urban working class. These workers faced harsh conditions and low wages. Resentment against the ruling class simmered. Political reforms lagged behind the changing times. Calls for a more representative government were met with resistance. Nicholas, clinging to his autocratic power, failed to address the growing discontent. The Tsar's disastrous involvement in World War I proved to be the breaking point. The war exposed the weaknesses of the Russian army. It brought economic hardship and widespread suffering. Russia was ill-prepared for the demands of modern warfare. Defeat followed defeat. The people blamed the Tsar. Opposition to the Tsar's rule grew. Revolutionary groups, long suppressed, found fertile ground for their message. Among them were the Bolsheviks. They were led by the charismatic and ruthless Vladimir Lenin. They demanded radical change. They called for an end to the monarchy. They wanted a socialist state. The stage was set for revolution. February 1917. Petrograd, the imperial capital, was a city on the brink. Food shortages and soaring inflation had brought the population to its knees. Women, desperate to feed their families, led the charge. They marched through the streets demanding bread. Their cries for bread soon turned into demands for political change. The Tsar, isolated in his palace, seemed oblivious to the magnitude of the crisis. He ordered the army to quell the unrest. However, the soldiers, many of whom sympathized with the protesters, began to disobey. The once unthinkable happened. The army, the bedrock of the Tsarist regime, was turning against the Tsar. The situation spiraled out of control. The February Revolution had begun. Faced with widespread mutiny and the collapse of his authority, Nicholas II made a fateful decision. He abdicated the throne. He did this for himself and for his heir, Alexei. The 300-year-old Romanov dynasty came to an abrupt and ignominious end. Russia was in chaos. The future was uncertain. The Tsar and his family were now prisoners of the provisional government. Section 4. Imprisoned. Life in captivity. The Romanovs were moved from one location to another, often under the cover of night to avoid drawing attention. They were prisoners of the provisional government, their every move monitored by armed guards. Initially, they were held at Tsarskoye Selo, a place that once symbolized their power and opulence. This was their luxurious palace outside Petrograd, filled with memories of happier times. Their life of privilege was gone, replaced by a stark and uncertain reality. They now faced an uncertain future, their fate hanging in the balance. They were constantly under guard, their freedom stripped away. However, they were treated with courtesy and respect in these early days of their captivity, a small comfort in their dire situation. The family found solace in their shared faith and in each other, drawing strength from their unity. Nicholas, stripped of his responsibilities, devoted himself to his family, finding purpose in their togetherness. Alexandra, despite her anxieties, remained resolute, her love for her family unwavering. They kept a close eye on Alexei, whose health was a constant concern. His hemophilia continued to be a concern, requiring constant medical attention. The children, their world turned upside down, tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy amidst the chaos. They played games, read books, and helped with chores, trying to keep their spirits up. Their lives were now confined within the walls of their gilded cage, a stark contrast to their former freedom. As the situation in Russia deteriorated, the provisional government decided to move the Romanovs to Tobolsk, a remote town in Siberia, far from the political turmoil. They hoped to keep them away from the growing unrest, believing that distance would ensure their safety. While their living conditions in Tobolsk were comfortable, their isolation deepened, cutting them off from the world they once knew. They were cut off from the outside world. They clung to hope, writing letters and praying for a miracle. They hoped for a miracle, a chance to be reunited with their former lives, but the future remained uncertain and bleak. Section 5. The Nightmare of Ekaterinburg, the Final Days. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, seized power in October 1917. Their grip on Russia tightened. The fate of the Romanovs hung in the balance. In April 1918, the family was moved once again. This time their destination was Ekaterinburg, a city in the Ural Mountains. They were placed in a house known as the Ipatiev House. This was their final destination. The house was heavily guarded. The windows were boarded up. The family was under constant surveillance. They were forbidden from speaking any language other than Russian. Their every move was monitored. Gone were the courtesies of their earlier captivity. The guards were hostile. The atmosphere was oppressive and filled with dread. They knew their situation was precarious. Nicholas continued to keep a diary. He meticulously recorded the events of their daily life. The entries reveal a man clinging to hope. He dreamed of a future where he could live a quiet life with his family. He never gave up hope for release. He prayed for his family's safety. He tried to shield them from the horrors that awaited them. He was a loving father to the end. Section 6. A brutal end. The execution of the Romanovs. In the early hours of July 17, 1918, the family and their 4 faithful retainers were awakened from their sleep. The air was thick with tension and uncertainty. They were told to dress quickly with no explanation given for the sudden urgency. They were informed that they were being moved to a safer location, a promise that offered a glimmer of hope amidst their captivity. Instead, they were herded down to the basement of the Ipatiev House, a place that would soon become their final resting place. They were lined up as if for a family portrait, a cruel mockery of their former royal status. The atmosphere was thick with dread, a scene of unimaginable cruelty and impending doom. Yakov Yurovsky, the commandant of the house, entered the basement with a grim expression. He read aloud the execution order, his voice echoing in the confined space. Suddenly, shots rang out, shattering the silence. The Tsar, the Tsarina, and their children were gunned down in a hail of bullets, their lives extinguished in an instant. The scene descended into chaos and bloodshed, a horrific tableau of violence and death. The initial volley of gunfire did not kill all of the children. Some of them survived the first round of shots, their cries piercing the air. They were finished off at close range, their cries silenced forever by the brutal efficiency of their executioners. The Romanov dynasty, once a symbol of Russia's imperial might and grandeur, met a brutal and tragic end in that basement. The bodies were taken to a nearby mine shaft under the cover of darkness, a grim procession of death. They were stripped of their clothing, mutilated, and thrown into the shaft, their dignity stripped away in death as it had been in life. The perpetrators attempted to hide their gruesome crime, desperate to erase any evidence of the atrocity they had committed. They poured acid on the bodies and burned the remains, hoping to obliterate all traces of the Romanovs. They wanted to erase all traces of the Romanovs, to ensure that their memory would be lost to history. However, their efforts would ultimately prove futile. The truth of the Romanovs' fate would eventually come to light, a testament to the enduring power of history and memory.